Okay, now that you know how to make a window in Tkinter, let's learn how to do something interesting, or at least somewhat interesting. Now, the good thing about Tkinter is that it provides us with a number of built-in objects called widgets that allow us to create interesting things in our graphical user interface window, including buttons, lists, drop-down lists, checkboxes, blocks of text, entry fields, sliders, anything that you can name of, it has a way of doing it. So we're going to go ahead and start off with the button widget, which is a way of making a press button similar to the one that you see when you start up or shut down your computer. To do this, we need to define a button object and store it in a button variable. In this case, I'll call the variable self.myButton, but you could call it anything that you wanted. In this case, I'll create a button object with the button function. Now, the first input for any widget function is the parent. Now, what is a parent exactly? Oh, the parent is the window or section of a window that your widget is going to go into. This is important because sometimes you can have GUIs with multiple windows and within each window multiple sections. In this case, we only have one master window called self.master, so that will be our parent. And now at this point, you can put any number of configuration options for your button. This is ways of setting things like what the button says, what the button does, how big the button is, or what color the text is. A complete list of this will be found on the handout that I emailed you, but for now we'll just use two of the options. The first is text equals something. In this case, I'm going to put text equals, click here. This is the text that will go on top of our button. The next argument I'm going to do is command equals. Now at this point, we can have the button call another method of our class and execute the code underneath that method. So I'm going to say we're going to execute something called self.printMessage. Now I haven't defined that yet, so let's go ahead and define it down here. Def print message, and of course we have to pass in self. So what are we going to do when the button is pressed is whatever is underneath this method. In this case, let's print something that says you pressed a button. And that's it. Perfect. So now we've got our button object defined and the code defined that we're going to execute once that button is pressed. Now the only thing that's tricky at this point is all widgets, after you define them, must actually be made visible. And there are a number of ways to do this. The way that I prefer, the one that has the most capability, is using the grid method. Self.myButton.grid. Here you give it a row and a column, which is its placement within the master window. Since we've only got one thing, we can place it at its starting position. Row equals 0, column equals 0. Remember that in Python, indexing always starts from 0. So in this line of code right here, we defined the button. Here, we made it visible. So let's go ahead and run this and see what it looks like. Save the script and call it. Here we go. Right at the top of the screen, it happens. And notice, when I actually click on the button, it prints out, you pressed a button. And every time I press the button, it executes the code. So I could execute it as many times as I want. Now, there's probably something more interesting than just printing you pressed a button to the screen that our button could do. But the point is that that's how you get it started. Now let's add something interesting. After you've defined all these things about the button, you can actually change those things later on and make them dynamic. Let's say we only wanted someone to push a button 5 times. Well, let's add in some logic here. We'll say that, well, let's do this. We're going to start a counter variable up in our initialization. Call it self.counter. And we'll set it equal to 0. You'll see why we're doing this in a second. Now what I'll do is every time we press the button, we'll say that self.counter increases by 1. Then, if we get to the point where self.counter is greater than or equal to 5, then what we can do is we can change what the button says. In this case, the way we do that is self.myButton.config. and then we can change whatever parameters we want. So in this case, we'll reset the text to say, stop it. You can see that whenever we call the config, we can change any parameters about the button and it'll update in real time. Now, let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. You can see this, we get the same thing as before. I click there and, well, I get an error. So what did I do wrong? I put the counter after the main loop. So let's move that. Remember, main loop always needs to be the last call. Let's see how this works now. You can see now whenever I click the button, it says you pressed a button. But after I click it 5 times or more, the button text changed. Now it says stop it. Pretty neat.